When you play the Game of Thrones,
Subscribe and like.
you die. There is no middle ground.
Welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be talking about, once again, The Winds of Winter, and maybe one of the reasons that it's not coming out. Well, at least in the short term anyway. George R. R. Martin does not seem any closer to releasing the book, but let's talk about it. So I did a video this week with Becky and JC, or The Advocate, which you guys will probably see at some point this week, about Daenerys. And one of the major parts that I came away with is just kind of, I think, the pacing issues of this next book, The Winds of Winter. Because if you take a step back and you look at all the POVs, I even did a video last week talking about which POVs I believe are going to die. When you really start to think about it, and you think about all the plot lines, the pace is just all off in terms of where some plot lines are compared to others. So for instance, Daenerys' plotline has a ton to go through. You could write 2 books, theoretically, on Daenerys' whole plotline, because she has a Dothraki plotline in terms of what's going to happen there. Is she going to get the Dothraki behind her, kind of fulfilling the prophecy of being the stallion who mounts the world? And then she's got to go back to Meereen and fix up the Slaver plot. And how is she going to cement Slaver's Bay to be free? Is that even going to happen at all? How does she interact for the first time with characters like Tyrion and Victarion, if she even gets to meet Victarion, which I think she probably will. I think Victarion will probably live that long. But you think about that plotline. That plotline could easily take 2 books in and of itself. But then you go to other plotlines. Well, the Young Griff plotline doesn't have this problem really at all. It's a very straightforward narrative. It's the rise of young Griff. We're going to spend a little bit of time at Storm's End with getting maybe a chapter to explain how they took Storm's End and young Griff meeting Arianne and all of that stuff. Then you'll have this stuff with the Tyrells. How will Jon Con and young Griff deal with that situation? And then from there, it seems like a straightforward march to King's Landing and young Griff taking the throne. That seems like a pretty normal arc for one book. It kind of is similar to Stannis' arc in book 2, right, where he builds up to attacking King's Landing. Very different, because young Griff has a lot more power than Stannis had at the beginning of the book, but you see where I'm going, right? Like, that arc has a pretty straightforward arc. Other arcs, like Arya's, for instance, I think is also kind of straightforward. It doesn't really have too much of a pacing issue. You have her finishing up her Braavos arc, and then you go to Westeros, and she probably messes around with some of the arcs in the Riverlands. But then you have other arcs, where you have Bran's arc, where it feels like we still need another half of the book, so you can have really a full book of Bran being with Bloodraven and the Children of the Forest. There's still more that we just don't know about Bran's plotline. Then he also has to get all the way south of the Wall, and if we think the Wall has to come down, or the others have to at least have breached the Wall by the end of the book, Bran has got to be pretty far south of the Wall at that point. So the problem that I think George might be facing is, how does he pace all of these characters so that they add up to where they need to be by the end of the story? Because like I talked about, Daenerys, for instance, has all these different things, but if we're going to have 2 books left of the series, Winds of Winter and then presumably A Dream of Spring, we still have to have Daenerys, like, at least landing or on her way to landing in Westeros by the end of the book. How does that even happen, right? Because we cannot start A Dream of Spring and Daenerys is still not in Westeros. That just does not make sense. The last book is going to be focused on the threat of the others, presumably the threat of Euron and even possibly Cersei if the 2, combine like they do in the show. There's a lot we have to do. And so if you're George, one of the things I could very easily see that are keeping him from finishing the book is the idea of, okay, maybe he had this grand arc for Daenerys, then maybe halfway through writing that he realizes, wait, I still have to write an entire Meereen arc for Daenerys. I have to then have her maybe going to all these different places that we were speculating at, like maybe Asshai, maybe she goes to Pentos, maybe she goes to Tyrosh, like Volantis. There's all these different places she could go. And so if you're looking at it from George's perspective, you've kind of written yourself into a really difficult hole. I think many people in the community have speculated at, even though I think that her Meereen arc is pretty solid in Dance with Dragons with Dany, George might be thinking, maybe I should have just had her start her journey of getting to Westeros in book 3, right? Maybe the end of book 3 is her deciding she's going to go to Westeros, all of that stuff. Now, we know why she doesn't do that, right? She feels she has a responsibility to her people, but just narratively, it could have helped George write Daenerys, because then at that point, Daenerys could have just had a travel book where she's going to these different, cities, and whether she's conquering or whatnot, she's making her way to Westeros instead of how she is ruling. Even though I think that The ruling narrative, which is a really big focus of both book 4 and 5, I do find to be very interesting. It's George just kind of put himself in a hole because he said, okay, we're only going to have 2 books left of the series. It just doesn't feel feasible to pace all of these characters to their natural endpoints of Winds of Winter and have it make sense, right? And that's the one thing I look at the books and I go, I just don't know how George can do it because the pacing would feel all over the place. Remember, we're going to start the book with basically the resolution to A Dance with Dragons. It'd kind of be like if we started A Clash of Kings with the Battle of the Whispering Wood, the Battle of the Green Fork, maybe Ned's execution, Daenerys bringing the dragons back. There's going to be a lot of payoff at the very beginning of the book with things like the Battle of Ice at Winterfell with Stannis and the Boltons and the Freys. And then you've also got another battle for Meereen, the Battle of Fire with Victarion showing up and maybe blowing Dragonbinder and the Slaver forces against Barristan. And then you have the Battle of Steel, the stuff going on at Storm's End with young Griff. It just feels like the plot lines are just at weird spots because for Daenerys, it's going to be kind of a normal start to her arc. It's going to be building up the Dothraki plotline, where other arcs are just kind of concluding from the last book with the Dance with Dragons. It's one of the reasons I think Dance with Dragons is my least favorite of the main 5 A Song of Ice and Fire books because it doesn't really have a conclusion like a lot of the other books. Now, some of it does conclude. I think Daenerys' arc, for instance, in that book concludes quite well. But other arcs like Theon, Asha's don't really have that natural endpoint. So that is kind of my, thought process with Winds of Winter. And I think all of us were really anticipating the book if we ever get it. It's going to be one of the most hyped books if it ever does get released. And I think that we have such high expectations that I think it clouds our judgment in terms of how difficult the book is to write. And will that translate to it being the best book of the series? And I definitely think it could be because it has a lot of payoff that's going to happen in it. I've compared it to, in a lot of ways, I think it's kind of like a Clash of Kings in a lot of ways because, like I talked about, some arcs will have major payoffs and some arcs will be much more about building up our characters and getting them into the places to set them off for the finale of the series. But let me know, what do you guys think about the Winds of Winter? Do you think there will be a pacing problem if Winds of Winter is released? Or do you think George R. R. Martin can fix all of those things? Which I definitely think if anyone's going to be able to do it, it's George. George is, when he does release stuff, is one of the best writers in the entire world and probably in the history of fantasy as a whole. So I will see you guys all in the next one, and I hope you guys all enjoy.